On the 7th of May, 2026, 3 United States Navy destroyers sitting inside the Strait of Hormuz came under the most coordinated assault Iran had launched in the entire war. Missiles, drone swarms, and dozens of fast attack boats pouring out from hidden coves along the Iranian coastline, all at once from multiple directions. Within hours, American F-35s were in the air, and by the time the sun rose the next morning, a stretch of Iran's coast that had been quietly protecting one of the most dangerous naval weapons on Earth was in ruins. This is the story of how a fleet of tiny, cheap speedboats became one of the most feared weapons in the Persian Gulf, why the United States spent months trying to hunt them down inside sea caves it could barely see into, and what actually happened when American stealth fighters finally got the order to go in. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to go back a few months earlier, to the 28th of February 2026. That was the day the United States and Israel launched a coordinated wave of strikes across Iran, a campaign that included the killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. It was one of the most dramatic single events in the modern history of the Middle East, and it triggered what analysts now simply call the 2026 Iran War. Iran's response was immediate, and it targeted the global economy directly. Tehran ordered the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula that roughly a fifth of the entire planet's oil supply passes through every single day. When Iran shut that door, oil markets around the world felt it within hours. The United States answered by imposing a naval blockade on Iranian ports in the middle of April, preventing tankers from leaving Iranian waters and cutting off Tehran's ability to sell its oil to the rest of the world. By the 1st of May, the Pentagon estimated that blockade alone had already cost Iran close to $5 billion in lost oil revenue. That is the backdrop for everything that follows. This was not a spontaneous skirmish. It was a slow, grinding economic and military siege, with both sides testing how far they could push the other without triggering a full-scale, uncontrolled war. And it's inside that pressure cooker that Iran leaned on the one asymmetric weapon it has spent 4 decades perfecting: the speedboat. If you've never heard of Iran's so-called mosquito fleet, it sounds almost laughably small next to America's aircraft carriers and guided missile destroyers. We're talking about small, fast, fiberglass and aluminum-hulled boats, some barely large enough to hold a machine gun crew, others upgraded with anti-ship missile launchers and rocket pods. Individually, none of them could challenge a single U.S. Navy warship. But Iran never built them to fight one-on-one. The entire doctrine behind this fleet is about numbers, speed, and geography. The origins go back to the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, a period historians call the Tanker War. Iran discovered that small boats operating out of the countless islands, islets, and coral reefs scattered through the Persian Gulf could dash out, strike a tanker or a warship with rocket-propelled grenades and machine gun fire, then disappear back into the coastline before anyone could organize a response. Iran also used these same boats to lay naval mines using small onboard cranes, a tactic that would go on to define naval warfare in the Gulf for the next 40 years. By the mid-2000s, American naval intelligence estimated Iran's fleet of small boats at more than 1,000 vessels. Over the years, this evolved into what Iran's own naval commanders describe as an asymmetric warfare doctrine. Instead of mass swarming with everything at once from a single direction, which proved devastatingly vulnerable to American air power during the Tanker War, Iran shifted to what's called dispersed swarming, sending groups of 20 or more boats at a target from several different bearings simultaneously, making it far harder for any single warship's defense systems to track and respond to every threat at once. The fleet itself is not one type of boat, but an entire family of vessels, each built for a specific job. There are the legendary Ashura-class boats, veterans of what Iran calls its sacred defense era, dating back to the war with Iraq. There's the Haydar 1 and 10, a newer speedboat that Iranian state media has claimed broke world speed records at 110 knots, which is roughly 204 kilometers an hour on open water. In one televised ceremony in Bandar Abbas, Iran's Revolutionary Guard showed off more than 100 of these high maneuverability boats, joining its naval forces at once, each one equipped with missile launchers, rocket launchers, and reconnaissance equipment. What makes this fleet genuinely dangerous, though, isn't the boats themselves. It's where Iran hides them. Along Iran's southern coastline, facing the Strait of Hormuz, there are networks of natural sea caves and hardened coastal shelters carved into the cliffs and islands. These caves let the Revolutionary Guard's navy disperse its boats across dozens of separate, hidden locations, rather than concentrating them in a handful of obvious ports that satellites could watch around the clock. A boat sitting inside a sea cave is nearly invisible from above. It's shielded from a lot of standoff weapons. And when the order comes, it can be in open water and at full speed within minutes, launch an attack, and vanish back into the coastline before a helicopter or fighter jet can even get a targeting lock. It's worth pausing on just how narrow the geography actually is here, because it explains almost everything about why this weapon works. At its narrowest point, The Strait of Hormuz is only about 33 kilometers wide, with the actual shipping lanes used by tankers squeezed down to just a couple of miles in each direction. On one side sits Iran's rugged, mountainous southern coastline, folded with inlets, coves, and small islands. On the other side sits Oman. Any large tanker moving through that corridor has almost no room to maneuver, no ability to suddenly change course to avoid a threat, and very little warning time if something comes at it from just a few kilometers away. A speedboat capable of 40, 50, even over 100 knots can cross that entire gap in minutes. That's the geography Iran built its entire naval doctrine around, and it's the same geography that has made this stretch of water arguably the single most strategically sensitive choke point on the planet. This is why, for years, American commanders in the region treated the Strait of Hormuz less like open, contested water, and more like a maze that Iran controlled the exits to. Confrontations were common long before the 2026 war even started. Back in 2021, a group of 13 Iranian fast attack boats conducted what the Pentagon called unsafe and unprofessional maneuvers near a U.S. Navy formation escorting the submarine USS Georgia through the strait, with two of the boats closing to within 150 yards of American vessels at speeds above 30 knots before a Coast Guard cutter fired roughly 30 warning shots to break contact. In 2016, the situation escalated even further when Iran's Revolutionary Guard actually seized two American small boats and their crews, an incident that ended with 10 U.S. sailors filmed on their knees in Iranian custody before their release. And these are just the moments that became public. For decades, American and Iranian naval officers have described a kind of running cat and mouse game in these waters, Iranian boats testing how close they can get before peeling away. So, when the 2026 war reignited in earnest, this speedboat fleet wasn't some minor side story. It was, according to Iranian military officials themselves, one of the central pillars of Tehran's entire deterrent strategy. Iranian state-linked media described the combination of speedboats, naval mines, and cruise and ballistic missiles as completing what they called the strategic encirclement of the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, Iran's entire plan for surviving a war against the world's most powerful navy hinged in large part on cheap boats hidden in sea caves. That brings us to March 13th, 2026, more than a week before the coordinated boat and missile assault we opened with. The United States Air Force conducted a large-scale bombing raid on Khar Island, a small but critically important island off Iran's Persian Gulf coast that serves as one of the country's key oil export hubs. This wasn't a blunt, indiscriminate strike. U.S. Central Command described it as a large-scale precision strike that hit more than 90 separate Iranian military sites on the island, while deliberately avoiding any damage to the oil and gas infrastructure that Khar Island exists to support. The stated targets included naval mine storage facilities and missile storage bunkers, along with a range of other military installations that had been supporting Iran's efforts to choke off shipping through the strait. Iranian sources reported more than 15 distinct explosions rocking the island, with witnesses describing nearly 2 hours of continuous airstrikes. Iran maintained that its oil infrastructure survived intact, and by most accounts it did, which tells you something important about how these strikes were planned. This wasn't about crippling Iran's economy directly. It was about surgically dismantling the physical infrastructure that let Iran's asymmetric navy operate, without giving Tehran the kind of catastrophic economic justification it could use to escalate into an even wider war. Then came May 7th. Iran launched what analysts have since called its most coordinated assault of the entire war, throwing missiles, drone swarms, and fast attack boats at 3 U.S. Navy destroyers positioned in the Strait of Hormuz, all in a single, tightly timed operation. This is exactly the doctrine Iran had spent decades building toward. Multiple threat types, arriving from multiple directions, designed to overload the defensive systems of American warships faster than their crews could sort out what to shoot down first. Some reports from the encounter even describe a possible combat laser intercept being used by American forces, a sign of just how layered and intense the defensive effort against that swarm actually was. The American response came fast, and it came from the air. F-35 stealth fighters were tasked with going after the network of coastal sites that had made this mosquito fleet possible in the first place. These aircraft weren't chosen by accident. The F-35's entire design philosophy is built around this exact kind of mission. Low observable stealth shaping that makes it difficult for coastal air defense radar to detect the aircraft before it's already struck. An electro-optical targeting system that lets pilots identify and engage small, dispersed targets like cave entrances and boat pens with a level of precision that older strike aircraft simply can't match. And a sensor fusion system that lets a single pilot build a real-time picture of a cluttered, chaotic coastline packed with dozens of separate potential targets. Against an enemy whose entire strategy depends on hiding in plain sight along a jagged, cave-riddled coastline, that combination of stealth and precision sensing is exactly the tool you'd want. There's also a practical, almost unglamorous reason the F-35 fits this particular mission so well, and it comes down to how these aircraft actually build a picture of the battlefield before a single weapon is ever released. Older strike aircraft generally rely on a pilot manually cross-referencing separate sensor feeds, radar in one display, targeting pod video in another, all while flying the aircraft and watching for threats. The F-35's sensor fusion system merges all of that into a single unified picture, automatically flagging and tracking multiple objects across a cluttered coastline at once. When you're trying to distinguish a hardened boat pen tucked into a sea cave from a natural rock formation a few dozen meters away, or trying to confirm that a suspected coastal radar site is actually active and not decommissioned, that kind of fused high-fidelity picture is the difference between a strike that actually degrades the target network and one that wastes an expensive precision munition on an empty cave. It also matters for something less obvious but equally important in a conflict this politically sensitive, minimizing strikes on the wrong target in a region packed with civilian fishing villages, oil infrastructure, and third-country shipping. Central Command later confirmed that during a 5-hour mission, American forces struck military targets across a wide swath of Iran's coast, including Bushehr, Chabahar, Jask, Konarak, Abu Musa, and Bandar Abbas, a list that reads almost like a roll call of Iran's most important naval and coastal defense hubs along the Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. A U.S. official described the targeting priority bluntly: Iranian military assets, including coastal surveillance systems, drone capabilities, and missile capabilities. In CENTCOM's own public statement, it described employing precision munitions against Iranian coastal defense systems, missile and drone sites, and maritime capabilities, all explicitly framed as an effort to further degrade Iran's ability to attack commercial shipping moving through the strait. That single wave of strikes marked the third consecutive night the United States had conducted attacks against Iran at that point in the conflict, underlining just how sustained and relentless this campaign against Iran's coastal infrastructure had become. This wasn't a one-off punishment strike. It was a deliberate, methodical campaign to dismantle, piece by piece, the physical network of hideouts, storage bunkers, and surveillance posts that let Iran's asymmetric navy function at all. The ripple effects were immediate and global. As word of the strikes and the reimposed port blockade spread through energy markets, oil prices spiked hard. Brent crude, the international benchmark, surged more than 9.5% in a single day, settling above $83 a barrel, its highest closing level in weeks, and its single biggest one-day percentage jump in over 6 years. The American benchmark, West Texas Intermediate, wasn't far behind, climbing more than 9% to settle above $78 a barrel, its biggest single-day jump since early spring. For a lot of people watching from outside the region, this is where the abstract military conflict in the Gulf suddenly became something felt at the gas pump. Iran, for its part, didn't sit quietly. Its Revolutionary Guard claimed to have struck and disabled 2 so-called rogue supertankers in the Strait of Hormuz, alleging the vessels had switched off their navigation transponders, ignored Iranian warnings, and attempted to pass through what Iran described as a mined shipping route. Whether or not you take Iran's characterization at face value, the message being sent was unmistakable. Even under sustained American bombardment, Tehran wanted the world to know it still had the capability and the will to threaten tanker traffic through one of the most economically important waterways on the planet. It's also worth understanding what a strike on a tanker actually looks like in practice, because it explains why insurers and shipping companies react so strongly every time one of these incidents is reported. A tanker moving through the strait is enormous, often longer than 3 football fields, but it is also slow, heavily laden, and almost defenseless against a fast, low-profile attacker. A single anti-ship missile or a well-placed limpet mine attached by divers or a small boat can be enough to disable steering, ignite a fire, or force a captain to declare an emergency and request assistance from naval escorts. It doesn't take sinking a tanker to achieve Iran's strategic goal. It only takes enough of these incidents, spaced out over weeks and months, to convince insurance underwriters that the risk premium for sailing through the strait needs to rise sharply, which in turn makes shipping companies think seriously about rerouting entirely, even if that means sending tankers on dramatically longer, more expensive journeys around the southern tip of Africa instead. The conflict didn't stay contained to Iranian and American forces either. Following the coordinated strikes at the end of February that killed Iran's supreme leader, Iran launched a series of ballistic missile and drone attacks against the United Arab Emirates, aiming primarily at American assets and bases located there. Those retaliatory strikes killed 3 foreign workers from Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, and injured 58 others. A grim reminder that, in a region this densely packed with U.S. military infrastructure, hosted by neighboring countries, the human cost of this war was never going to be confined neatly within Iran's own borders. Jordan's air defense systems intercepted and shot down 4 missiles fired from Iran on a separate occasion, and Iranian-backed Houthi forces in Yemen even declared that Saudi-flagged ships attempting to reach the Indian Ocean would become targets, showing just how far the shockwaves from this conflict had spread across the wider Middle East. By late June, a ceasefire that had briefly calmed the region looked increasingly fragile. On June 27th, and into the early hours of the 28th, the U.S. military said it struck multiple targets inside Iran at the direction of President Trump, in response to what the Pentagon described as continued Iranian aggression against commercial shipping. Iran's Revolutionary Guard responded within hours, claiming it had struck American military sites in both Kuwait and Bahrain in retaliation. That exchange, happening within a single weekend across 3 different countries, illustrated just how quickly this conflict could reignite even after periods of relative quiet, and how the entire Gulf region, not just Iran and the continental United States, had effectively become the battle space. Then, barely a day before the time of this recording, on July the 29th, 2026, the pattern repeated itself again. President Trump promised to hit Iran, in his words, very hard, after the U.S. military said it had intercepted a surprise attack Iran attempted against American forces the day before. That night, CENTCOM announced it had completed what it called a heavy wave of strikes against Iran, hitting dozens of Revolutionary Guard targets that included military command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance and defense sites, and maritime capabilities once again. Explosions were reported across southern Iran, including in Bandar Abbas and on the Persian Gulf island of Kish. Oil prices climbed once more in the aftermath, and shipping companies began actively searching for alternative routes after the Houthis renewed their threats against tankers trying to reach the Indian Ocean through waters near the conflict zone. Step back and look at the sheer frequency of these exchanges, and a pattern starts to emerge that's almost rhythmic. Iran probes, whether through a drone, a missile, a swarm of boats, or a claimed tanker strike. The United States responds with a wave of airstrikes against coastal military infrastructure, usually within a day or two, usually described by CENTCOM in nearly identical language about degrading coastal surveillance, missile and drone sites, and maritime capabilities. Oil markets spike, hold for a few days, then partially settle back down as traders wait to see whether the exchange escalates further or fizzles into another uneasy pause. Then, weeks later, it happens again. That rhythm tells you something important about the nature of this conflict. Neither side appears to be pursuing a single decisive battle that ends the war outright. Instead, both sides seem to be locked into a long war of attrition and signaling, where each round of strikes is less about achieving total victory and more about demonstrating resolve, punishing the other side's last move, and probing for weaknesses before the next escalation. So, months after that first coordinated assault on May 7th, and after repeated rounds of American airstrikes explicitly targeting coastal surveillance systems, missile and drone sites, and the physical infrastructure supporting Iran's speedboat fleet, where does that leave the Mosquito fleet itself? This is where the story gets genuinely complicated, and where you have to be careful not to just accept whichever side's narrative sounds more satisfying. American officials have repeatedly framed these strikes as significant blows against Iran's naval capabilities, degrading its ability to threaten shipping and defend its coastline. And there's real evidence for that. Dozens of coastal surveillance and defense sites, missile and drone facilities, and command centers have been hit across a long list of locations, spanning virtually the entire length of Iran's Gulf coastline, from Bushehr in the north down through Bandar Abbas, Jask, Konarak, and Chabahar near the Gulf of Oman. That is not a symbolic gesture. That is a sustained campaign against the actual physical backbone of Iran's coastal defense network. But Iran's own state-linked media has told a very different story. Iranian outlets have insisted that despite months of what they call U.S.-Israeli aggression, the Revolutionary Guard Navy's speedboat fleet remains, in their words, fully intact and ready for swarm attacks in Hormuz. One Iranian newspaper with close ties to the Revolutionary Guard described this fleet as the winning card in the Persian Gulf, and claimed the boats had become one of the most complex challenges facing American forces in the region over the past 2 decades, specifically because of the swarm attack tactic. Iranian commentary from earlier in the conflict claimed that during the initial weeks of fighting, American naval forces struggled to effectively counter these vessels precisely because they could emerge from hidden sea caves, launch their weapons, and disappear back into what one Iranian commentator called the labyrinthine coastline before American helicopters could respond. Now, you have to weigh that kind of claim carefully. Iranian state media has an obvious incentive to project strength and deny that months of American airstrikes meaningfully degraded its capabilities, in the same way that any government engaged in an active war has an incentive to talk up its own resilience. But even accounting for that bias, there's a structural reason to take the underlying claim seriously. The entire design philosophy behind Iran's dispersed, cave-based basing strategy is built specifically to survive exactly this kind of air campaign. If you build a weapon system around the assumption that your enemy has total air superiority and can strike any fixed target it can see, Then you don't put your assets in a handful of easily identified locations. You scatter them across dozens or even hundreds of small, hardened, hidden sites along hundreds of kilometers of jagged coastline, and you accept that some of them will inevitably get found and destroyed, while betting that enough will survive to keep the threat credible. That's really the core tension running through this entire campaign. The United States has the tools, air superiority, stealth aircraft, precision munitions, and persistent intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance to systematically hunt and destroy individual sites along Iran's coast. Iran built its entire coastal defense doctrine anticipating exactly that kind of pressure, betting on dispersal and concealment rather than trying to match American firepower directly. Neither side has ever needed a knockout blow to claim success by its own definition. American commanders can point to a growing list of confirmed strikes on named coastal defense hubs and call that meaningful degradation. Iranian officials can point to the fact that their boats are still operational, still capable of harassing shipping, and still launching coordinated swarm attacks months into the campaign, and call that proof their deterrent strategy worked. What isn't in dispute is the economic and human cost of that standoff. Oil markets have swung wildly with every fresh round of strikes, spiking nearly 10% in a single session more than once, as traders priced in the risk of a fully closed Strait of Hormuz. Commercial shipping companies have had to actively reroute tankers away from a waterway that carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil, adding time, cost, and risk to global energy supply chains. Countries neighboring the conflict, from the United Arab Emirates to Jordan to Kuwait and Bahrain, have found themselves pulled into the fighting, either as targets of Iranian retaliation or as hosts to American strikes launched in response. And people with no direct stake in the political dispute between Washington and Tehran, foreign workers in the UAE among them, have paid for this conflict with their lives. There's also a quieter, less visible cost that tends to get lost in the headline numbers about oil prices and strike counts, and that's the toll on the people actually stationed along Iran's coastline and inside these hardened defense networks. Coastal surveillance sites and missile bunkers aren't remote automated facilities. They're staffed around the clock by Revolutionary Guard personnel, radar operators, boat crews living out of dispersed bases for weeks at a time, technicians maintaining drone and missile systems and facilities that are, by design, difficult to resupply precisely because they're meant to be hidden. Each named location on that CENTCOM target list, Bushehr, Chabahar, Jask, Konarak, Abu Musa, Bandar Abbas, Kish, represents not just a set of coordinates but an active duty station where sustained bombing campaigns translate into real casualties, equipment losses, and enormous pressure on Iran's ability to keep its coastal defense network fully staffed and supplied month after month. There's a comparison worth making here to help put the scale of this campaign in perspective. During the original tanker war in the 1980s, it took years of sporadic small boat attacks and mining incidents before either side inflicted the kind of sustained, concentrated damage that's been packed into just a few months of this 2026 conflict. Modern precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft, and real-time satellite and drone surveillance have compressed what used to be a slow, grinding naval campaign into something that can unfold in a matter of hours per strike. A single 5-hour mission in May hit 6 separate coastal hubs stretching across hundreds of kilometers of coastline. That kind of tempo simply wasn't possible for any military, including the United States, even 2 decades ago. It's part of why this conflict, despite covering many of the same strategic ground as older confrontations in the Gulf, has moved so much faster and drawn so much more global economic disruption in such a compressed time frame. Looking at the full arc of this campaign, from the assassination of Iran's supreme leader in February, through the naval blockade in April, the precision strike on Khar Island in March, the coordinated missile, drone, and speedboat assault on American destroyers in May, and the repeated waves of American airstrikes against coastal defense and surveillance sites that have continued into July, a clear pattern emerges. This has become a war fought as much over geography and concealment as it has over firepower. The United States holds an overwhelming advantage in raw military technology, and its use of stealth aircraft like the F-35 against Iran's coastal hideouts represents a genuine and sophisticated effort to strip away the concealment that Iran's asymmetric navy depends on for survival. But Iran built an entire naval doctrine around the assumption that it would eventually face exactly this kind of technologically superior opponent. And every indication so far suggests that doctrine has, at minimum, kept its speedboat fleet functional enough to keep launching attacks months into a sustained American bombing campaign. There's one more angle worth considering before drawing any conclusions, and it's the question of resupply and rebuilding. Destroying a missile bunker or a boat pen carved into a sea cave is one thing. Preventing Iran from rebuilding it, restocking it, and putting it back into service is another challenge entirely and arguably the harder one. Iran has spent 4 decades developing domestic capacity to manufacture small, cheap, fast boats using relatively low-tech fiberglass and aluminum construction methods that don't depend heavily on imported components, subject to international sanctions enforcement. That's very different from something like a fighter jet or a large warship, which can take years to replace and depends on supply chains that are far easier to monitor and interdict. If Iran can keep manufacturing new speedboats domestically, at a pace even close to the rate American airstrikes are destroying hidden bases and stored equipment, then the fundamental math of this campaign shifts heavily in Tehran's favor over the long run, no matter how many individual strikes CENTCOM successfully carries out on any given night. That single question, how fast can Iran rebuild versus how fast can the United States keep finding and destroying targets, may end up being the real deciding factor in how this entire chapter of the conflict is ultimately remembered. Whether that counts as Iran successfully weathering the storm, or as a slow, grinding attrition campaign that will eventually exhaust Iran's ability to rebuild and resupply these hidden coastal positions, is genuinely still an open question. What's clear is that the fight over who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway barely 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point but responsible for moving a fifth of the world's oil, has become one of the defining military and economic conflicts of 2026, and it shows no sign of being resolved anytime soon. Every few weeks brings another round of strikes, another retaliation, another oil price spike, and another reminder that, in this particular corner of the world, a handful of hidden speedboats and a few dozen stretches of cave-riddled coastline have proven far harder to fully neutralize than anyone on either side probably expected when this war began. What started decades ago as a relatively crude wartime improvisation, small boats darting between islets during the tanker war, has evolved into one of the most closely watched tests of modern air power against dispersed, low-cost asymmetric defense in the world today. Every strike CENTCOM announces against Bushehr or Bandar Abbas or Jask adds another data point to that test. Every claim from Iranian state media that the Mosquito fleet remains fully intact adds a counterpoint. And every fresh oil price spike is a reminder that, regardless of who ultimately proves right about the fleet's survivability, the rest of the world keeps paying a very real price for a fight over a strip of water, barely 33 kilometers wide.